Happy Tuesday po sa inyong lahat, my dear parents, learners, and faculty and staff. We are the 7th of September 2021, and we are on the Tuesday of the 23rd week in Ordinary Time. Samahan po ninyo ako sa ating daily reading reflections. Sa ating first reading, again from the letter of St. Paul to the Colossians, chapter 2, verses 6 to 15. Ang pinaka-gist po ng ating first reading ay God brought you to life along with Christ, having forgiven us all our transgressions. So basahin po natin ang first reading. Brothers and sisters, as you receive Christ Jesus the Lord, walk in Him, rooted in Him and built upon Him, and established in the faith as you were taught, abounding in thanksgiving. See to it that no one captivates you with an empty, seductive philosophy, according to the tradition of men, according to the elemental powers of the world, and not according to Christ. For in Him dwells the whole fullness of the deity, bodily, and you share in this fullness in Him, who is the head of every principality and power. In Him you are also circumcised, with a circumcision not administered by hand, by stripping off the carnal body with the circumcision of Christ. You were buried with Him in baptism, in which you were also raised with Him, through faith in the power of God, who raised Him from the dead. And even when you were dead in transgressions and the uncircumcision of your flesh, He brought you to life along with Him, having forgiven us all our transgressions, obliterating the bond against us, with legal claims, which was opposed to us. He also removed it from our midst, nailing it to the cross, despoiling the principalities and the powers. He made a public spectacle of them, leading them away in triumph by it. So anong ibig sabihin ng ating first reading? First ay yung verse 8. Yan, sa chapter 2 verses 8 to 23, Paul confronts the teaching of Jewish troublemakers in Colossae. His comments suggest they denied the full deity of Christ. Siyempre, mga Hudyo ay hindi sila niniwalang Diyos si Kristo. They promoted the rituals of the Mosaic law as indispensable requirements for living in covenant with God. Paul corrects these misunderstandings for his readers by asserting the divinity of Christ, that Jesus is God, and stressing that Gentile believers are already complete in Christ, apart from the ceremonial works of the Old Covenant, circumcision, dietary laws, Sabbath observance, temple festivals, etc. So verse 8, philosophy. Although this term can refer to speculative theories about God, man, and the universe, it was also used by Hellenistic Jewish writers such as Josephus and Philo to refer to the Jewish way of life. This is probably Paul's meaning here, yung Jewish way of life, itong philosophy na to. It's true nevertheless that every philosophy is vain that disregards or denounces what God has revealed as good, true, and beautiful through Jesus Christ. Human tradition. Religious customs produced and promoted by men, not God. Perhaps Paul is following the example of Jesus by cautioning readers of human traditions passed on by Pharisees and synagogue elders. For Paul, only divinely instituted traditions that stem from Jesus and the apostles demand obedience from the church. Elemental spirits. Okay, sa Colossians chapter 2 verse 8, word study po tayo. Stoicheia. Stoicheia. I don't know if correct yung pag-pronounce ko, no? Stoicheia. Greek, elements or rudiments. The term is used 7 times in the New Testament and is common in Greek literature. It can refer to the material elements of the cosmos, like earth, air, water, and fire, or to heavenly bodies like the sun, moon, and stars. It can also refer to angels or demons that regulate the course and movement of these elements. These ideas are closely connected with ancient forms of worship. For idolatrous Gentiles, the elements were deified and worshipped as gods. Itong mga elementong sun, moon, no, sinasamba. For ancient Israel, the liturgical calendar was determined by the rhythm of the elements, especially by the cycles of the sun and moon. Paul groups the worship of Israel and the nations together, since both are subservient to these visible and invisible elements of the natural order. In contrast to this old order, Paul stresses that Christ is seated far above all things, seen and unseen. So dapat ang sabihin natin ay si Kristo, hindi mga elemento ng created realities. United with Him, believers no longer worship within the confines of the created world, but through the sacraments they enter a new order of worship that is supernatural and heavenly, where Christ lifts them far above the created elements of the cosmos. Okay, so ngayon sa verse 9, marami tayong pwedeng pag-aralan dito sa first reading. Deity dwells bodily, a powerful assertion of the full humanity and divinity of Jesus Christ. The mystery of the God-made man was a stumbling block for many in Israel who were skeptical that Yahweh's presence could reside in a man and who were scandalized that the Messiah should suffer the curse of crucifixion. Yan po. Circumcision of Christ, sa verse 11. The circumcision of the heart. Okay? The procedure is performed in baptism, the sacrament of spiritual rebirth. The Israelites were marked with the covenant sign of circumcision, but their rebellion over the centuries proved that their hearts remained as uncircumcised. Moses realized that this would continue until Yahweh circumcised the hearts of his people himself. Paul interprets this vision of Moses in sacramental terms, insisting that Christ accomplishes in baptism what circumcision only signified in ancient Israel. It is the moment when God cuts away from our hearts the fleshly desires that keep us from loving and obeying Him as we should. Paul lays a biblical foundation for infant baptism, inasmuch as circumcision was administered to newborn babies 8 days after birth. Tradition bears this out, as Saint Cyprian recounts that the council held in North Africa in the 3rd century declared that Christians need not delay the baptism of infants until the 8th day. Behind this assertion lies the assumption that the early Christians saw in baptism what the Israelites saw in circumcision, the sacrament of initiation into God's covenant people, open to adults and infants alike. So, ang dami nating natututunan ngayon sa first reading. Okay, so tatlo pang i-comment natin. Uncircumcision of your flesh, sa verse 13, indicates that most or all of the Colossians are Gentiles. The bond, sa verse 14, a list of charges filed against the sinful human family. Christ destroyed this legal certificate on the cross when He canceled our debt or guilt and won pardon for our crimes. Paul is probably thinking of the Mosaic Law, which as the written expression of God's precepts, pronounces divine curses upon sin. In this scheme, Jesus mounted the cross to bear the curses of the old covenant so that the blessings of the new could flow forth to the world. As a further benefit, Christ frees us from the ceremonial observances of the old covenant, which merely signified our need for salvation in the first place. And last but not the least, sa ating first reading, principalities and powers, sa verse 15. Legions of demonic spirits. Christ conquered the satanic powers decisively and dramatically on the cross. Paul depicts this in terms of victory march, recalling how Roman generals dragged prisoners of war through city streets to be disgraced and ridiculed after a successful military campaign. Ang ating responsorial psalm ay galing sa Psalm 145, 1b to 2, 8 to 9, and 10 to 11. The Lord is compassionate toward all His works. I will extol you, O my God and King. and I will bless your name forever and ever. Every day will I bless you, and I will praise your name forever and ever. The Lord is compassionate toward all his works. The Lord is gracious and merciful, slow to anger and of great kindness. The Lord is good to all and compassionate toward all his works. The Lord is compassionate toward all his works. Let all your works give you thanks, O Lord, and let your faithful ones bless you. Let them discourse of the glory of your kingdom and speak of your might. The Lord is compassionate toward all his works. Ang ating ebanghelyo ngayon ay hango sa Luke chapter 6 verses 12 to 19. Ang pinaka-gist ng ating gospel ay he spent the night in prayer. He chose 12 whom he also named apostles. Jesus departed to the mountain to pray and spent the night in prayer to God. When day came, he called his disciples to himself, and from them he chose 12, whom he also named apostles: Simon, whom he named Peter, and his brother Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, the son of Alphaeus, Simon who was called the Zealot, and Judas, the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. And he came down with them and stood on a stretch of level ground. A great crowd of his disciples and a large number of the people from all Judea and Jerusalem, and the coastal region of Tyre and Sidon, came to hear him and to be healed of their diseases. And even those who were tormented by unclean spirits were cured. Everyone in the crowd sought to touch him, because power came forth from him and healed them all. So ngayon punta tayo sa commentary ng ating ebanghelyo. First, so verse 12, all night, Jesus undertakes a prayer vigil to prepare for selection of the 12 apostles in the morning. So bago pipili si Jesus ng 12 apostles, ay nag-prayer vigil siya. Sa verse 13, apostles, those who will preach the gospel and lead the early church. They are emissaries invested with Christ's royal and priestly authority. Like the 12 patriarchs of Israel, Jesus chooses 12 men to be the father figures of the renewed kingdom of Israel, the church. Kaya may 12 apostles kasi may 12 patriarchs sa Israel. So please see Genesis chapter 35 verses 22 to 26 para ma-confirm po kung bakit 12 apostles. May connection to sa Old Testament na yung 12 patriarchs or later on 12 tribes of Israel. So chapter 6 verse 17 to 49, Luke's sermon on the plain is similar to Matthew's longer sermon on the mount. Both begin with beatitudes, both advocate love of enemies, and both end with the parable of two builders. The sermon encapsulates the high moral standards of the new covenant. Sa last commentary sa verse 17, Tyre and Sidon, two coastal cities north of Palestine. In Phoenicia, people from these areas are predominantly Gentiles, a fact that highlights Jesus' popularity outside Israel. So my dear parents, my dear learners, my dear faculty and staff, thank you for joining me in this daily reading reflections ditong September 7, Tuesday of the 23rd week in Ordinary Time. See you again tomorrow.